Welcome to Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. I'm Michael Brooks.
I'm Anna Kasparian.
And on today's show, we have Sean Jacobs from Africa as a Country joining us, talking about the global dimension, the global and local dimension of the uprisings against police violence, Black Lives Matter, capitalism, and a whole bunch more. Really excited about that. If you're watching this, please make sure to hit like. At the end of today's show, we'll try to take a couple of super chat questions. And of course, we have Salt. We have a whole bunch of stuff to get to, as we always do. And go get yourself a proper subscription to Jacobin magazine. That's how the whole thing runs. And check out the teach-in series, the archives. There was just a great one on Juneteenth with Bill Fletcher Jr. that I just watched. It was great. Anna, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah. One of the series that I appreciated on Jacobin was with Bhaskar and Adolph Reed. So good. And just so many important conversations being had, thought-provoking, interesting, and I love that. I love that. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot this week, Michael, is, Matt Taibbi wrote a pretty provocative piece. There was all sorts of infighting on Twitter over it, but I think that while I disagree with some portions of what he wrote, I think he raises a lot of serious concerns that we should be aware of. This notion of like moral cruelty, right? Which we see on Twitter a lot. And I think that you got to keep your eye on the prize and on the priorities. And that is to ensure that everyone has their basic human needs met. And unless we all work together and fight together aggressively and not get distracted by BS drama and gossip, I think we can accomplish those things. There's just this virus that affects the left that I just can't stand, and it's the infighting. Sometimes over nonsense, because we're always fighting for scraps on the left, right? You see it with indie journalists all the time. And I happen to call out one of them this week on Twitter because I couldn't help it anymore. But let's just acknowledge who the real enemies are and stop with the nonsense infighting.
I thought Taibbi's piece was great. I mean, there was various specific details which one could agree with or disagree with, obviously, like anything else. But the basic point, I mean, again, was totally clear and totally obvious. And the response, it was one of those things where like the response to it validated a lot of the arguments of it. And I think, Matt Christman has actually been super insightful on this stuff. And this is another one that I'd recommend, the log off one that he did with Amberly Frost and Ben Fong. That was also brilliant. And Ben Fong, I should shout, Damage. It's a great, really, really brilliant analysis website that are publishing a lot of really insightful people. And that basically the technology, really built into the technology, is the incentivizing of all of the cruelty, gossip, nonsense, and drama, and the kind of ultimate irony of seeking the intensity of that experience as just being, I mean, it happens outside, it happens across all politics, but it is really specifically antithetical to the left because it's completely antithetical to a culture of either, frankly, like openness, strength, forgiveness, change, and also just sort of like being like fully paid up, hopefully, like grown up on some level, and just the complete lack of humility, I think too, is also gross, because again, I think like ironically, if it was building a culture where people could be much more open about all of our, where they're relevant. Most of them, aren't, because like privacy is obviously an obvious thing, but like, people's growth, people's mistakes, people's transgressions that everybody, I'm so sorry to say, has done. It creates like this like punitive, insane madhouse atmosphere where there isn't an incentive structure to grow. So, and
That's
I think
so true.
it cuts across all areas. And I think, Taibbi definitely, obviously, identified some of it. And, it was funny, I asked Noam Chomsky about it, and I tried to ask him beyond that article on TMBS, because I didn't want to it's a big question. And it's like so many of these things, like you try to get them outside of like various silliness on Twitter and get to like the real meat of things. And he was just like, yeah, the left better have a substantive commitment, in this case to free speech. And the only reason this is even a question now is because it's happening not only to the left. Historically, the left has always been the one, whether it's state or private censorship, that has been primarily threatened. So, yeah, it's not just like a question in so many ways of like not producing all these stupid and toxic cultures. It's also really recognizing that it's just antithetical if you actually have an appetite for still, trying to do the big things.
Yeah, absolutely. You're so right. And I think the most important part about it is everyone should embrace growing. And if you're involved in politics, you care about politics, if you're involved in the right ways, you're going to go through a journey, right? And that journey is uncomfortable because it involves self-reflection, and it involves really analyzing whether your preconceived notions make sense or should evolve. And so it's creating a situation where you're intimidated of or afraid of being like lambasted by having open and frank conversations where you kind of put it all out on the table. It just creates this system where you don't ever, go through that very important journey. You don't challenge yourself, and you're just constantly living in fear of sharing what you really think. And you should have what you think challenged. Like, to be honest with you, Michael, like I started watching your show because I loved what you had to say about certain people like Dave Rubin. It was funny. That's what hooked me. But you started challenging some of my views on capitalism, for instance. And it was uncomfortable. It was super uncomfortable. But I'm like, okay, am I just going to pretend like this argument doesn't exist, or should I explore it? And I'm glad that I did, right? I saw personal growth and development through that process. And sometimes you say things that maybe I don't agree with, but that's okay, right? I trust you as a source, as someone who has a point of view, a worldview that's worth listening to. So that's all I have to say about that. But it's just a great piece, and everyone should read it.
Yeah, totally. And we're all, we're all working on it across the board. And I just think it's very, very important to hold that mindset across the board. And yeah, and I'm sure this is something we will talk about more. Besides that, on a completely different tip before we get to the commentaries, I do want to just say Chronix did a cover probably about a year ago of Naughty Dread, which everybody should listen to on YouTube after they delete their Twitter app. That's one recommendation. Also, my buddy Willie Q, who's a rapper, has a great new track out, which I'm going to tweet out later. So, but honestly, like, do other stuff. Read books, get outside, listen to music,
Yep.
Try to like have like actual conversations with real people, get away from all that bullshit. And speaking of which, I actually am going to talk a little bit about a really important distinction that I think we need to make in my commentary on this week's show. So the left has absolutely correctly been allergic to the hashtag resistance response to Trump, right? We've seen everything from, at its most insidious, a lot of people, and, culminating obviously in the nomination of Joe Biden, frankly, who have no appetite for any type of systems change, for looking at any of the core conditions that led to the rise of Trump or Trumpism. There is endless numbers of, frankly, bipartisan consensus in terms of protecting permanent interests in Washington, the national security state, the pharmaceutical industry, Wall Street, and so on. Now, of course, there's distinctions still generally. There's obviously going to be more members of the Democratic Party that will be more likely to regulate and respond to these industries. But overall, we have certainly seen a neoliberal governing consensus, and the consequences of that have led to Donald Trump, and we can't ever lose sight of that. And we also can't lose sight of the fact that as we always say, the endless melodrama about Trump's tweets, and even at times the correct analysis of this administration's viciousness, racism, cruelty, and frankly, just core Republican policies. Overall, as Noam Chomsky says, that the Republican Party, with its climate policies alone, is the greatest threat of any singular organization to the future of the planet. And I think in many respects, he's absolutely right. But we pushed back because we noticed, and some people were very clear about this, particularly with critiques of things like Russiagate, Matt Taibbi as an example, that by sort of some of the super hyped up melodramatic rhetoric, we were missing really important distinctions and sort of over dramatizing Trump in some respects. Now, that being said, it's very important to also not lose sight of where there are serious authoritarian tendencies in the Trump administration and in the Republican Party, and also not losing sight of the fact that even as we can talk about big structural corruption, there still is distinctions inside the governing process. And Trump is absolutely taking things to a new and very serious extreme. And we need to be very, very real about that and think about it when we think about, as an example, frankly, strategic voting. And everybody knows I am absolutely 100% an advocate of voting in a way as to get Donald Trump out of office. It's actually very necessary in my view. So let's talk about a couple of things that have happened just recently. There is a huge conflict right now, the Southern District of New York, Donald Trump and Bill Barr. And Bill Barr is really the key conduit here. Go back and look at his whole career, going back to Iran-Contra, his work with George H.W. Bush. This is an authoritarian political figure. This is someone with a profound, deep, and abiding contempt for any form of, I would argue, even really limited constitutional liberal democracy. There is a prosecutor named Jeffrey S. Berman who has been overseeing the Southern District of New York and has been involved in investigating multiple people around Donald Trump, including, of course, the Michael Cohen prosecution. And now reportedly he's looking into possible illegal activities, and I mean, possible, I would say highly likely, of Rudy Giuliani and Rudy Giuliani's efforts to root around Ukraine for political dirt on Joe Biden. And actually, I'm sorry, we should start with number 2 first. Actually, I'll just read from this. And then we'll put up number 1 in a second. But let me just read this quote first. This is from the New York Times. Mr. Barr abruptly announced the resignation late Friday night of the prosecutor Jeffrey S. Berman, United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, whose office has been at the forefront of corruption inquiries into Mr. Trump's inner circle. The office successfully prosecuted the president's former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, who went to prison, and has been investigating Mr. Trump's current personal lawyer, Rudolph W. Giuliani. But Mr. Berman then quickly issued a statement denying that he was leaving. I have not resigned and I have no intention of resignation, Mr. Berman said, adding that he had learned he was, quote unquote, stepping down from a Justice Department news release. Let's put that tweet up of Berman's full statement in a tweet here from the Southern District. He writes, I learned from a press release from the Attorney General last night that I was stepping down as United States Attorney. I have not resigned. I have no intention of resigning. My position, to which I was appointed by the judges of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. I will step down when a presidentially appointed nominee is confirmed by the Senate. Until then, our investigations will move forward without delay or interruption. I cherish every day I work with the men and women of this office to pursue justice without fear or favor, and intend to ensure that this office's important cases continue unimpeded. This comes on the heels of mega scumbag John Bolton, who Anna will be talking about in a moment, revealing in his book, including, among other things, Donald Trump endorsing the detention and systemic abuse of the Uyghur population in China, that he also was willing to lean on the Southern District to intervene and stop an investigation involving a Turkish bank in a conversation with Turkey's leader, Tayyip Erdogan. And so this process, which again, as the Attorney General, as the Southern District head says, he was confirmed by a set of judges, not appointed by the president. There hasn't been a proper process to fill his office, and he learned he was being let go of or pretending he was resigning in a press release. Now, this is very hard to connect with ongoing criminal investigations with Trump and with Trump associates. Then, of course, we go back to the firing of the inspector generals. And yes, obviously, it was very easy for this to sort of get absorbed into other conversations about impeachment, which was not politically successful and so on. But the reality is that inspector generals are supposed to serve an independent oversight function to oversee corruption and fraud and abuse in the federal government. And clearly, Trump is getting rid of them as political retribution. Now, it's his right to do so, but we need to be clear about why he's doing it. I also want to take us back to, and I'm not sure the state of this, but a terrifying move at the beginning, even before the Democratic uprisings against police violence and the Black Lives Matter movement and the food riots as well, and of the last several weeks. Bill Barr's attempt to hold people in indefinite detention. I'm going to quote now from a piece in The Hill. Barr's power play for essentially open-ended suspension of criminal proceedings and related matters has nothing to do with stopping the spread of COVID-19. Barr's proposals, at least as far as we know from public reporting thus far, involve giving judges the power to suspend court proceedings whenever the district court is fully or partially closed by virtue of any natural disaster, civil disobedience, or any other emergency situation. The only reason to suspend court proceedings would be if no judge or court orders or other personnel were available to deal with these cases. That's not the case. And now it is highly unlikely to ever be the case. This was a piece from a fellow at the Cato Institute, written at the time that Barr was proposing. That's Patrick Eddington from the Cato Institute. In the last several weeks, of course, with the protests, we saw Donald Trump order the gassing of nonviolent protesters, the tear gassing of them, so he could have a photo op. Advocacy of martial law moves by Senator Tom Cotton, and other ongoing threats from the White House and the Attorney General. So even as we can absolutely and also even understand contextually that the overall erosion of civil liberties in our time has been a bipartisan project, going back to as one of many examples, Bill Clinton signing the Effectiveness and Death Penalty Act in the 1990s, and the bipartisan consensus on the absolutely dangerous Patriot Act that has damaged our civil liberties and privacy so fundamentally. That being said, it is very clear that between Trump and Barr, there is a expansive view of the power of the unitary executive, which is going to be used by absolutely a uniquely corrupt and grotesque and capricious head of state. People should be real about it and factor it in when they think about this election.
Yeah, I love the last point, especially because, you know, for Democrats under a Democratic administration, when we see the erosion of civil liberties, even if it's that erosion isn't being exploited as much as it could be, we need to think about, these Democrats need to think about the fact that a Republican can come into office, someone who's far more authoritarian, someone like Donald Trump can come into office. But I also want to just raise the issue of Congress also giving up its own power in order to embolden and empower the executive branch, because we already know what Bill Barr's ideology is. We already know that he doesn't believe in a system of checks and balances. He doesn't believe in how our system of government is set up in the first place. And so when you hear stories about Nancy Pelosi striking a deal with Steve Mnuchin over trillions of dollars in stimulus money, you have to consider the fact that that legislation is written in a way that essentially allows Steve Mnuchin to use that money with absolutely no oversight, with absolutely no transparency, and it gives the executive branch power, unchecked power, right? So we need to hold Democratic members of Congress accountable as well when they just willy-nilly hand over power to the executive branch and go against our entire system of government, which is supposed to have checks and balances.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we're just so we're synced up because, my topic is related. I wanted to, do a deeper dive on this show in regard to John Bolton's upcoming book, because there's definitely a lot of celebration among Democrats regarding Bolton's book and some of the revelations in the book. Of course, he wrote about Donald Trump and his experience within Trump's administration. But keep in mind that most of the revelations that we've learned about so far, we already either suspected or knew about in different contexts. So let me tell you why I think this is important to discuss. So while people are celebrating John Bolton's upcoming book, it hasn't been published yet, but we've seen excerpts from it in various legacy media outlets. I do want to remind everyone that while he's attacking someone as disgraceful and as terrible, evil, cruel as Donald Trump, it doesn't change the fact that Bolton himself is pretty bad in every single way that you can accuse Trump of. So he is being celebrated because people are looking at him or seeing him as some sort of whistleblower, right? But keep in mind that he is publishing this book with a profit motive in mind. He had an opportunity to testify against Donald Trump during the impeachment investigation. He refused to do so. He claimed that he didn't want to do so until the courts got involved and forced him to. But really, he was looking forward to publishing this book, making a quick buck. And I highly recommend that everyone avoid giving into that or purchasing it or spending any money on it. But I also want to just point out that John Bolton is awful in every way that he accuses Donald Trump of being awful. And the reason why I say that is because while Bolton might seem a little more sophisticated or a little smarter, if you really look at his actions, he's no different than Trump in what he would do if he had unchecked power. So let's start off with the fact that he calls Donald Trump stupid. I mean, he implies it. There's no question about it. But in reality, John Bolton himself is pretty stupid. And I think there's no better example than this back and forth that he had on Tucker Carlson's show back in 2018. It has to do with the war in Iraq, a war that should not have happened, a war that, of course, turned out to be a complete and utter disaster. But John Bolton still refuses to admit that it was a huge mistake.
So you've called for regime change in Iraq, Libya, Iran, and Syria. In the first two countries, we've had regime change, and obviously it's been, I'd say, a disaster. I think we agree.
No, I don't agree with that. And let me.
You don't think it's been a disaster?
No, because to argue that, you have to argue. Let's just take Iraq to begin with. You have to argue that everything that followed from the fall of Saddam Hussein followed inevitably, solely and unalterably from the decision to overthrow him. And that's simply not
I would never argue that. I'm merely arguing the macro picture, since you just said that Iran is the single greatest threat to us and to that region. I think you'll concede that Saddam was the greatest counterbalance to Iran, and they were empowered by his fall. So I think it's fair to say if you think Iran is the real threat that way, it's kind of hard to defend that decision, right?
No, because I think your analysis is simple-minded, frankly.
Okay.
The Iranian threat, which stems from the revolution of 1979, was underway quite apart from what Saddam Hussein was doing. The Iranians have been trying to get nuclear weapons for 25 years.
So you don't think the fall of Saddam made Iran stronger?
I think it made the fall of Saddam, no, did not make Iran stronger. What made Iran stronger ultimately was the withdrawal of American forces in 2011.
So if you, I mean, I'm not saying you're the only person who thinks that. You're the only person I have met who thinks that.
He's the only person who thinks that because he's a moron, right? Bolton is arguing that the only mistake that the United States made in invading Iraq was not remaining in Iraq even longer. So pulling troops out is what destabilized the region. But what Tucker Carlson is saying there is actually pretty right. We further destabilized the region because war hawks like John Bolton, with his profit motive in mind, have never met a war that they didn't love, have never seen a situation where they didn't want to invade a country and further destabilize a region. The fact that he's like one of the few people who still denies that that invasion was a complete and utter disaster gives you a sense of just how utterly stupid he is. But the difference between him and Trump is that Trump speaks like a fourth grader. So it's obvious to anyone, even if you're not following politics, that he's a moron. But John Bolton is no smarter. And John Bolton is certainly not any less of a racist. For instance, back in 2008, when Obama was just about to get elected, this is on election night, here is the simple-minded and stupid, evil thinking of John Bolton. Take a look.
Since we are about to elect the first African-American as president, it is a very significant historical fact. And I take it, therefore, around the world, criticism of the United States for being a racist nation will now stop, right?
Oops. So obviously we're in the middle of a massive movement calling out racist policing in this country. We all know that racism continues to be a huge systemic problem in the United States. And John Bolton has repeatedly denied that and has turned a blind eye to the insane cruelty of the Trump administration at the border. The fact that dozens of immigrants who are seeking asylum have died in those border cages. John Bolton had no problem with that. John Bolton willy-nilly worked for the Trump administration because A, of course, he wants power, but more importantly, because he didn't have a problem with any of the cruelty that was implemented by the Trump administration. He's also just as dangerous as we know. John Bolton has advocated with war with pretty much every country. He wants to invade Iran. He wants to invade North Korea. He's a complete and utter disaster when it comes to those issues, of course. But just like any other war hawk, he is unwilling to put his own life on the line in order to fight in those wars. One of his comments in a Yale reunion book said the following: "I confess I had no desire to die in a Southeast Asian rice paddy. I considered the war," meaning the war in Vietnam, which he was very supportive of, "I considered the war in Vietnam already lost," right? So he's just like Trump in being a draft dodger, and he has no problem putting other people's lives on the line in order to invade other countries and to pursue the imperialism that the United States is so well known for. He's also dangerous in that he doesn't believe in democracy. He doesn't believe that he should have to go through any elections, any type of process of democracy in order to have a position of power. One of his classmates told the Yale Daily News, quote, "Bolton aspired to be the highest ranking non-elected official in the government." And by the way, here's a little more of his Trump-like love affair with putting others in danger for profit.
Another goal of his, apparently, was to verbally abuse his colleagues. One employee said he tried to force her to lobby for less regulations on baby formula in developing nations. She refused, citing studies that formula is dangerous in developing nations because of lack of access to clean water. The employee alleges Bolton shouted that Nestle, a maker of formula, was an important company, and then screamed that she was fired.
So that's who John Bolton is. And he is well known for being pretty vicious to people who work for him. And this is my favorite part about John Bolton, my favorite thing about John Bolton. John Bolton is, of course, like pretty much any other politician, Democrat or Republican, a hypocrite. But the hypocrisy is particularly delicious right now as he's facing a lawsuit from the Department of Justice, which, of course, is attempting to block the publishing of his book. Now, it's already too late. The book will be published, and we've already seen excerpts from it. But I bring this up because if the lawsuit is successful, John Bolton will not be able to keep the proceeds from his book. The Trump administration will be able to garnish them. And I think that's pretty hilarious. Bolton cried about it, has been whining about it, and is arguing that he's being censored, that he has important information to share with the American people, and that the government is trying to censor him. Which is interesting, especially because the Trump administration is citing classified information in its quest to block the publishing of this book, right? Well, John Bolton in the past had very strong opinions on whistleblowers, on censorship, and didn't really seem to agree with the John Bolton of today when it came to whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning, for instance. So let's take a look at that.
What do you think of Bradley Manning?
I think he committed treason. I think he should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
What does that mean?
Well, treason is the only crime defined by our Constitution, and it says treason shall consist only of levying war against the United States or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. And he gave our enemies a lot of aid and comfort.
So what should happen to him?
Well, he should be prosecuted, and if he's found guilty, he should be punished to the fullest extent possible.
And what is that?
Death.
You think he should be killed?
Yes.
So he thinks that, Chelsea Manning should have been killed for disclosing government secrets. The same thing that John Bolton is being accused of right now by the Department of Justice. Bolton also had very strong opinions on what should happen to Edward Snowden, who informed all of us that we were being spied on indiscriminately by the Obama administration. And so what did he have to say about Snowden? Take a look.
I mean, my view is that Snowden committed treason. He ought to be convicted of that, and then he ought to swing from a tall oak tree.
So does Bolton think that he should also swing from a tall oak tree? Because according to the Washington Post, Trump, who called Bolton a traitor and was incensed that he walked out of the White House with copious notes, has told allies he'd like to see Bolton be charged, according to people familiar with his remarks. Donald Trump even said, quote, "I will consider every conversation with me as president highly classified." And then, by the way, the Justice Department argues disclosure of the manuscript will damage the national security of the United States, the same kind of ridiculous argument that Bolton was on board for when it came to Manning and Snowden, by the way. To be clear, defendant's manuscript still contains classified information, as confirmed by some of the government's most senior national security and intelligence officials. So there's a huge problem with how information is classified by the government. Obviously, information that should not be classified is classified all the time in order to avoid any and all transparency. I disagree with the way that happens. It doesn't matter if it's done by Democrats or Republicans. I think that the American people deserve to know what we learned through whistleblowers. But I just find it hilarious that John Bolton wanted to see whistleblowers hanging from oak trees, while at the same time, when it comes to his own profit motive, he wants to fight back against government censorship. He's trash. Do not launder his image. Do not fall for it, and do not celebrate him, period.
Of course. And it's so, I mean, each wave of these people that get embraced by, MSNBC or the Democratic establishment, it just gets more disgusting, with each step. I mean, for what it's worth, I ended up having so much more sympathy for Michael Cohen than almost like any of the rest of them. Like Michael Cohen, I liked. He was just sort of like, hey, like I thought we were just doing like Burrow scams. Like, I don't think you should actually like be a white supremacist president. But I think, just the idea of him talking about Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, who risked everything. Edward Snowden's in exile. Chelsea Manning was jailed and tortured for exposing, extensive and systemic government wrongdoing. he wants them murdered. He's inciting against them. And now his, basically just like his gossip book is, sacrosanct. And by the way, it is. I mean, look, of course, the idea of the Trump administration trying to block publication, thank God they're being ruled against. Obviously, it's a huge threat to civil liberties. And of course, we support the publication of the book. But his sense of, his willing to condemn people for actual exposure to death, and then just his kind of like gossip score settling trash. I mean, it's, and honestly, there's some excerpts in the book where, John Bolton is such a threat to all living things that, like, Donald Trump, you're like, oh, well, thank God Donald Trump was there, because he was the reason we didn't escalate on Iran. Or, Jesus Christ, shut up. Let him talk to North Korea. John Bolton, even down to the Nestle baby formula. Just a very, very uniquely grotesque human.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is kind of interesting to like do an honest analysis of the pros and cons. Actually, there were a lot of cons with Bolton and Trump's administration. I remember when Trump was clowning on his mustache, and I was relieved. I'm like, thank God Bolton has that mustache, who Donald Trump, who only wants to hire people out of central casting, finds ugly enough to not want to hire him, right? But then eventually, after like his 28th national security advisor is like, I don't know, like, how about this like thinner Wilford Brimley guy? Let's bring him in, right? Like, it's just incredible. But I'm glad that they didn't get along, and I'm glad that Trump wasn't influenced by Bolton pushing him for more war with Iran, with North Korea. It would have been a complete and utter disaster. And we've already seen the negative impact of Trump ripping up that Iran nuclear deal, but it could have gotten much worse with Bolton still in that administration.
Absolutely. So I guess we'll take a brief break, and we're going to come back. This is going to be a great conversation with Sean Jacobs. He's one of the, I think he is the founder of Africa as a Country, which is a fascinating website people should be reading. They also have their own YouTube channel. So I'd recommend, after you watch this, you go over and subscribe. We'll be back in a couple of minutes.
All right, I think we're back. Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to Weekends with Anna and Michael. Do we have our guest yet?
Or though.
There we go. All right. Joining us now is Sean Jacobs. He's an associate professor of international affairs at the New School and founder and editor of Africa is a Country. Sean, thank you so much for joining us. I should call you Professor Jacobs, actually.
So Sean is okay.
All right. So I'm so happy that you're here with us. I have so many questions to ask you, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement that's happening here in the United States, but also globally, we're seeing protests in response to policing in various countries, and I think that's important. So I just wanted to talk a little bit first about why you think the Black Lives Matter protests spread across the world.
I mean, I think firstly, so I'm thinking particularly from the perspective of, someone who's from like Africa or specifically South Africa. I think we underestimate the power of US cultural politics. So, this is sort of common sense, right? The influence of Hollywood, the ubiquity of American media, that large parts of the world sort of, even if they know that there's a particularity to American politics around race, they sort of, it's both a kind of aspirational politics and something they can identify because of movies, because of television. So that's one thing. I also think that a lot of American radical politics, particularly African-American politics, have always been, Malcolm X. I mean, I actually think Malcolm X way more than Martin Luther King because of his appeals to like the UN or the kind of politics that went with that. And then I think the internet is obviously like the big thing, which is, and there's a piece on our website by Will Shoki, who's a young South African writer, lives in Johannesburg, that writes about like why, one is, as I said, this idea that like we all are watching kind of America. Secondly, there's definitely the impact of social media, that people look at social media. And I think it's also fascinating that normally, because America is, well, the United States, because, it's a continent and then a country, the US is seen as often exceptional. A lot of people never really thought of the US as something that they could look to and identify for I would say, radical politics or more progressive politics. But in this instance, it felt like the US was the place in which people sort of finally took on the police. So yeah, there's similar kind of problems around the police in the average African country. There's statistics like in Kenya, the police murdered something like 144 people last year. It's only June and they've murdered already something like nearly 95 people. So they're on course to break that record for the year. So some of the same issues happen in these different countries. They manifest differently. So in Kenya, the police is black. The police is not white. In South Africa, the police commissioner is black. Most of the police force are black. But some of the same methods are being employed. And they're for various reasons. They inherited from colonialism. But I think more pointedly, some of the methods that all these police use, they get training from the Americans. And so I think people began to see these connections. They began to identify it. And I think also one other quick point is the presence of various diasporas, particularly in Europe, in Britain, people of African descent, people from the Caribbean, Black Britain, collectively as Black Britons in France, where there's like a long struggle by people without papers, where there's like systematic racism by the police against people who live in like, lower income neighborhoods on the outskirts of like the big cities. So I think this moment just presented an opportunity for people with various different grievances, and that meant it manifested itself very, differently. One other quick example. In some countries, it wasn't necessarily police brutality, but it was about public monuments. You see, in Belgium, it was about getting rid of like monuments dedicated to King Leopold II, who was responsible for what essentially amounted to a genocide in the old Congo. In Britain, like they threw like statues of people associated with slavery. So it was just because of that connection between mass media, the internet, I would say, this kind of relationship that people have with American popular culture, and especially it's often radical culture or culture dressed up as radical. It resonates around the world. Yeah.
Yeah, Sean, I want to follow up on that with maybe the very good potential of the dynamic you're outlining and maybe some of the downside of it. And so one thing, and Alex Huckley has a piece in Damage where he sort of does a very interesting critique of this as basically American soft power getting exported globally. And I think in some ways he really overstates it, but he has some kind of interesting examples of places where, say, like Roma are abused by police, and that isn't discussed. But then, like the exact replication of language in a situation that applies to Chicago or New York is sort of imported and replicated. And then another example, an unfortunate example, would be like this kind of, and now it's sort of everybody's on the bandwagon of trashing this book, so I'll do it a lot less. But this kind of this white fragility stuff. Now we've got to translate these terms from just sort of like kind of corporate training seminars in Europe. Now that might be the sort of downside of this kind of export of a certain type of neoliberal kind of identitarian sort of thing. Now, on the other hand, what I'm actually curious about, if these do become properly global, in the really inspiring way they are, there are global uprisings against racism, against white supremacy, against police violence, and all of the issues that those think into. And I'm actually thinking of a piece that William Shockey wrote for your site about called "The Class Character of Police Violence," where he sort of talks about the post-liberation policing in South Africa. And what struck me was that, and again, I guess, one, the paradox of leaders like Cyril Ramaphosa, who has his own direct relationship, in the Marikana massacre, which maybe you could talk about, using this to sort of burnish domestic credentials. But then on the other hand, what if this did become properly globally reciprocal, that Americans could start reading Williams' piece, could start, contextualizing in a way that we really do see the global dimension and, therefore the capitalist dimension of it.
Right. So I think there's like three parts to.
Yes.
There's three places that I could maybe say something useful. One is I think about how how reciprocal is this relationship between what's happening in the U.S. and are Americans taking on ideas from other parts of the world. I think the other one is about the class character. The first is I'm gonna sort of answer the first part of your question by, I actually think that we underestimate like the impact. Well, let me say Occupy. If we take it back a little bit, so in most of these African states, South Africa is probably unique because it's kind of the last sort of left wing or movement that is broadly left wing that gains political power. It gets into power, but then it slides back into kind of, a sort of globally accepted neoliberal model. Now, we could debate the various reasons for it as to why it does that. It might have to do with local conditions because it's trying to placate and make sure that whites, right, take a buy-in into this new order. So Nelson Mandela's kind of posture is mostly that of reconciliation. The other is that like the world conditions at that point forces them to take a neoliberal model. Like Mandela goes to Davos, they tell him, he's like, I'm going to nationalize stuff. They tell him, you can't do it. So in a lot of these places, they become sort of straitjacketed by like a global consensus. But the effects for the people who live there is mostly negative, right? It's unemployment, it's underemployment, it's lack of investment in social services. And when it comes to the police, it's basically the same like the police elsewhere. But if much of what I know is what's happening on the African continent. I think Occupy is like the first moment in which people there, and this is why I think when you sort of say like, how much of what we see in America is what is it that we can see in America, and can we replicate it? Is it helpful to us or whatever? So if you're living in some other part of the world, and there is this movement that begins in the United States that explicitly identifies the problem of one of the failures of capitalism in very crude ways, the 1% against the rest, but people can like catch up to that. So you saw similar kinds of movements in African countries. In Nigeria, I think in 2011 or 2012, there's something called Occupy Nigeria. It's about a very specific thing, which is that the state guarantees people a what they call like people don't call it gas, but like a subsidy. And the government is corrupt. People don't see anything from the state, but they want that subsidy, that oil subsidy. And so they form a movement called Occupy Nigeria. And you see similar kind of movements develop in South Africa. I think it's still mostly around what they call service delivery, like free water up to a point, not to privatize electricity, evictions. So that's the kind of politics. So I think it was sort of just like that for a while. What we forget is like Bernie Sanders has like just from what my sense was, he invigorated like the American left. He was probably not going to win. I saw Adolf said the other day he wasn't probably going to win the election, but he invigorated like the left here. And I think somebody else said like we won the argument, but we didn't win. We didn't have the numbers. So I think some of the ideas that Bernie made here, if you go back, there's an old article that I wrote on the site, which is that you saw African immigrants in Britain saying like the things that Bernie Sanders identified are the things that we identified. There was something called Africans for Bernie. There were in South Africa, in African countries, people wondered whether or not they could get a Bernie Sanders, like a leader like Bernie Sanders. So they weren't like necessarily, yes, he's like an old white man, but that wasn't the thing that they connected to. It was what his ideas were. So there's some, because of this way that American ideas spread, but in this case, I think it's like, now it's like a particular set of American ideas. Ocasio-Cortez is also a kind of a version of it. I also think Ilhan Omar is the most exciting African politician there is right now, in the way that she identifies what is wrong with American imperialism. You don't hear this kind of thing from the average African politician, or that they would do these kind of things when they have power and they can use it to change policy. So when I say like this, I mean, if I sort of have to be more specific about what I said first, it's that what I think is interesting that's coming out of the US, that kind of energy. And one last point is on this one. I think Black Lives Matter this time around is a very different movement. I think people underestimate that this is not the Black Lives Matter of 2013. The Black Lives Matter of 2013 was, anger. I think it then became very much about Black politics, Black identity politics, Black power politics. This is something else. I mean, I live in New York City, I live in Brooklyn. This is a multiracial coalition. It's multi-generational. I don't think it's, maybe not yet, it's not captured because, we're in like the standoff. So it's in motion. So I'm also probably projecting onto it. But I don't think it's been captured by any sort of NGO politics or, there's good foundations and there are bad foundations. But what people use it for, it's like foundation politics. It's very much like it's open-ended. It's very, very radical. It can go everywhere. And interestingly, it also has popularized a whole bunch of ideas that we didn't think were like regular, say like a month ago. Defund the police. And maybe it could also be like the thing that extends that argument, that takes it somewhere else, right? That people extend it to like social services, etc., and so on. On the second thing about the class character, just quickly, the class character of politics in South Africa, in places like South Africa. So in places like South Africa, it happens that the police inherited many of the methods from apartheid. And what Black South Africans who are middle class don't often like make a connection is that the police are obviously not often attacking them, but it's going for working class people in South Africa. So those are the differences I think that William addressed in his, and I could come back if you want me to this. On the reciprocal question quickly, because I know I'm sort of droning on. On the reciprocal question, I think the point is like, I'm not so optimistic that Americans are learning a lot from other places. I was talking to someone the other day about some of the movements, just from my experience in South Africa. I think it would be fascinating for Americans to go look back at say like something like the United Democratic Front, which was a very populist movement in the 1980s that happened in South Africa after the 1970s, which was very explicit like Black consciousness politics. And out of that, something else had to come, which was like cross-class, cross-racial. And it will be interesting for me if Americans go look at the example of, what people did with Black Lives Matter. Also, with the United Democratic Front in South Africa. So I'm not confident that the people in the U.S. Maybe not people on this program, but can see those connections and go like, hey, there's something we can learn from other places aside from maybe, oh, this is how you protect yourself. Hong Kong said people used umbrellas, but I think at a more substantive level, like in terms of like ideas about how to think about the United States as an imperial power, how to think about your place in it, how to think about public policy. No, I'm a little bit more pessimistic about that.
So it's interesting. I'm overall a very pessimistic person, but one thing that I've noticed when it comes to some of the younger individuals who are involved in this movement in the United States is they absolutely are bringing up the issues related to U.S. imperialism, which gives me a little bit of optimism. So, for instance, I'm hearing a lot more about the egregious nature of the United States orchestrating coups in Latin American countries. And I love that because I think that consciousness not only needs to exist, that type of American culture needs to change. And, in a recent interview, you said Americans rarely care what the rest of the world thinks about them. And I see that culture. I mean, it's in its infancy right now with young people in particular. But I am starting to see a little bit of a shift there. And I think it's important to, emphasize the role of independent media in the United States in kind of pushing that change in culture. I also want to learn lessons about what happened in the aftermath of, ending the apartheid in South Africa, because you raised some really interesting, situations that I think most people don't talk about, they don't think about. You mentioned in the same interview that I referenced earlier that change didn't happen overnight. Even as the apartheid ended, there were some negative outcomes, including people who were exiled, people who were persecuted, prosecuted. Can you talk about that a little bit and talk about what people in America can learn from that?
So I think a lot of these debates were also actually happening here. I noticed some of this during the Bernie, when Bernie was sort of kind of, in ascendance and it wasn't clear that he was not going to be the candidate. You heard some of these things, which was let's say Bernie Sanders did become the president, then in order for him to fulfill his agenda, you still needed like a mass movement. So one of the problems of post-apartheid South Africa was that one of the first things that the ANC, whether it was willful or whether they thought it would assist them in governing better, is that they demobilized like the mass movements in South Africa. So South Africa quickly, that moment that I referred to as the United Democratic Front, that was the first mass movement in South Africa's politics since the 1950s, like a multi-class, multiracial movement with a radical set of ideas about how they wanted to transform South Africa. So the first thing that the ANC did tell them was to disband and fall and become part of ANC structures. The ANC had operated in exile, like a very kind of close political party. It had certain kinds of methods that it inherited from its associations with sort of Stalinism, with the Soviet Union. So that was one problem, that they sort of got sucked into the ANC. I think the second thing, I think, was while it seemed like a good idea at the time because you wanted to build consensus around a certain national agenda, the ANC made an alliance with the trade union movement and the Communist Party. The Communist Party very sort of influential with ideas, and the trade union movement bringing the masses. The problem there again was that meant that the trade union movement, the federation, because the biggest one is called COSATU, didn't have that same kind of clout that it had when it was a popular movement, kind of alongside and in tandem, but in a sort of critical relationship with the ANC. Now it was part of the governing coalition. Many of its leaders went into the state. And this one other quick example, the last one was around particularly economic policy. So in that period right after the end of apartheid, the ANC brought along a lot of progressive economists, South African, from elsewhere, to come to South Africa and talk about those lessons, that, the wrong turns, the false starts, and maybe we could do something different. And apart from that comment, the sort of glib comment I made about Mandela going to Davos, there was also the way in which the ANC, for some strange reason, when it had like mass support, and obviously it could maybe pull off a bunch of reforms, like radical reforms in the economy. Instead, it went a very simple route. It got rid of those people, and it started appointing a sort of more like orthodox, more sort of mainstream group of people to advise them. And with like in 2 years, it abandoned it. Like it had a really good program called the Reconstruction and Development Program, and it abandoned that for a more neoliberal program. So there's something there about one, the masses of South Africa, if you want to know, the popular movements trusted the ANC to implement the model to change South Africa. And so I think one problem that you can get here is like, yes, the energy currently is very, it's incredible to watch the energy on the street. I mean, it's also difficult to sort of like figure out, as I said to somebody earlier today, it's like a party or like a protest on like an endless loop, but so you don't know where it could go. So at some point, people are going to have to like say, okay, so what do we mean by defund the police? Like, how would that work? And then we implement it. But then there has to be a mass movement in the street that like constantly pushes and cajoles like the state or the people who represent you in these formal institutions, Congress, state legislatures, city councils, to make sure that those things happen. And I think that's one problem that happened in South Africa. The streets withdrew from politics. Of course, they made a comeback in the early 2000s with all the protests around electricity and water and AIDS and so on. But I think by then they had been significantly weakened. So now in South Africa, you have those same kind of movements, the inheritors of the 1980s, the inheritors of the early 90s, but they just don't have the same power. And the ANC, because now it's a very disciplined political party who's all about political power, it can avoid them. It doesn't have to listen to them. And whereas before they could have the ear of the ANC, now they have to take the ANC to court constantly. And if they win the case, the ANC as a government does not implement these things which are people's rights.
So, okay, so that's the situation in South Africa. And I guess I'm wondering, because I think one of the things that's also happening now that is really important about these movements, particularly if we talk about them globally, is that there was a wave that I guess you could argue started with Syriza and going through Bernie that has kind of ended, where there was this sense that maybe a genuine, let's just say, social democratic agenda had an electoral track, and it's been, destroyed in Greece, repelled in the UK, and in the United States, in coalition in Spain. So I guess there is that. Do you think that there's a potential, even though it's, the ANC is very hegemonic and there's a lot of difficulty ahead, is there the potential for a new wave in African countries from an electoral perspective as people sort of burn out on, formation, like legacy formations like the ANC, one of the most important movements in history, but now is governed for decades?
So firstly, let me give you the South African example, and then I'll say quickly about 2 or 3 other examples. I think in South Africa, the moment that presented itself as something that could be different was what happened on campuses in South Africa between 2015 and 2017. There was this massive national student movement. They used hashtags Rhodes Must Fall, which was a reference to a colonial figure statue, and he was a stand-in for kind of this sort of symbolic presence. It's like when people are now throwing statues into the harbor, or I think today they took down a statue in DC, and I think there's one also in Georgia that's going to go down. So that was the one part of it, very symbolic, struggle about representation. Linked to it was another struggle called Fees Must Fall, which had to do with free public higher education. And then that movement was sort of allied with the trade union movement, but not nationally, just on campuses around the conditions of the workers who provide services in dorms, in cafeterias. And this was called the outsourcing movement, because the universities were outsourcing the work because they didn't want to deal with unions. They wanted to deal with labor brokers. So that movement, and crucially, actually, this is important about this movement, they questioned like the consensus around the ANC's right to govern, or that the Black South Africans, which is the majority of the people, had voted for the ANC and had somehow felt, the ANC wasn't delivering to them, but nobody had done anything about it. And so the students explicitly questioned like the wisdom of the 1994 political deal. So here was something that was saying, what would politics look like after nationalism? Like, so that what you call the legacy formation. So they brought us to power. Now what comes next? What's fascinating about that movement was I mean, for various reasons, and everybody has their theories, but after 2017, they just sort of fell apart. They kind of, internal contradictions, politics of purity, like identity politics. Also, it's a generational thing. People graduate. And so I would have, which is kind of why I sort of always talk about what I think is interesting about this BLM moment. It will be interesting to say, where does this popular energy that's in the street, like, where does it go? What will it go back into its silos? Will it degenerate into identity, what we might call identity politics? Or could this be like something that could build bigger? So that's I think what happened in South Africa. And linked to that, I think, was the inability of like the historically the movements that we associate with the left in South Africa. I think they just didn't know what to do with the students, because they were kind of uncomfortable with identity politics, even though it was necessary at the time. I think they just couldn't make sense of it, rather than sort of like, oh, this is a moment, it presents political possibilities. They wanted to go back to like, what the theory says. Or I think some of their methods was just not, or they had become NGOs, or they had become sort of wedded to the ANC. So it didn't come off. There are other movements, I think, that are interesting. For example, there's in Tanzania, in Uganda. And again, these depends on like the nature of the regime. So a very a regime that is a proxy or a junior partner of the US's war on terror, run by this guy called Yoweri Museveni, who's been in power since the 80s. We started out like as an African Marxist with a very radical program, but he's still in power. I think it's like 30 odd years later. State corruption, patronage networks, you can see the same thing with Trump, but like there it's way more pronounced, and it's very difficult for people to break the stranglehold. Police brutality, authoritarianism, one-party state. And so there's like, at the level of like sort of popular culture, there was this musician, his name is Bobby Wine, like a reggae musician. And it's not clear yet where his program might go, but making music videos, he educates people with like a sort of presenting a range of ideas around public goods, around people's right to healthcare, people's right to political rights, and he's trying to run for president in the next election. So this guy Museveni has won every election since what they call democratization in the early 90s, and he has a way. He controls the electoral commission, the army runs stuff. So it will be interesting to see what happens with this moment there. I think the one other quick example is what we've seen in Nigeria, where there you have sort of like a pact between different elites, like you govern this term, and then we have an election, and then the other set of elites govern. And of course, there's like rents and stuff involved. And so there's a lot. There's actually in Nigeria, strangely, there's a long history and a very deep history of left politics. And so there was a candidate who ran, Sowore. He ran in this last election, about 40 years old. But unfortunately, he didn't go far, partly because they arrested him. And they locked him up, I think, right after, like around the election and right after. And every time that he's about to get out of prison, they lock him up again. But so, so it's kind of depressing. I think the moment is very depressing. But and this is my quick last point on this. When Occupy first emerged, right? Occupy happened here in New York. I was around for that. And then it was like quiet. Then later on, Bernie Sanders came. Jacobin came, whatever. Like at the level of popular culture, organized PSA is having a comeback. So it's like there's something about the kids who are involved in Fees Must Fall. At some point, they're going to move into the state. They're going to become civil servants. They're going to move in the NGOs. They're going to work for the social movement. So we don't know where that's, that for me, that's the hope that I'm having, that a couple of years are going to pass. They're out of school. They're settling out of university, college, and they settle into the professions. They settle into the movements, and then hopefully something interesting can come out of that.
I just want to say real quick, shouts to Milton Alamati. from Black Star News, who I've done a lot of work with and who is extremely committed on
Mm-hmm.
Iran. So I just want to recognize him in this conversation because we discussed Iran.
So in a talk that you gave for The Nation, there was an interesting point brought up about how sports was utilized in order to accomplish a post-apartheid South Africa. And I thought that was so fascinating. I do want you to talk about that a little bit, but do so after we watch this lovely video featuring Ben Shapiro. He's a well-known conservative here in America who's upset that his safe space of sports has been infiltrated with politics. Let's take a quick look at that.
Now, Clay, it does make me wonder whether inevitably we're going to end up with basically two sports leagues. Whether at some point people are just going to want a sports league that does not allow this sort of stuff to impede the play or get on the field, and people are just going to view that. Because I got to say, like, I've been fairly tolerant of this stuff in terms of watching sports my entire life. There are only a couple of times where I've really turned off the TV. One was, when it came to Sports Illustrated, I was a lifelong subscriber to Sports Illustrated. My parents gave it to me for my bar mitzvah. I had Sports Illustrated subscription for like another 10, 12 years. I used to keep the old issues in a box. I mean, that's how much I enjoyed it. And then when they decided, you know what, it's important for us to feature Caitlyn Jenner on the cover, when Bruce Jenner had not been an actual athlete for 3 decades. And all of a sudden I'm reading about transgenderism in Sports Illustrated. I was like, okay, I'm done. I can't do this anymore because this has nothing to do with sports. And I subscribe to a sports magazine. I'm not doing this anymore. And the other is during the Kaepernick protest, when it became incumbent on people to somehow approve of the hands up, don't shoot symbology that was being put out by particular players. I'm tempted to do the same with the NBA now that you have LeBron James, who was willing to basically virtue signal on behalf of the communist Chinese government, but rip Drew Brees. It's getting to the point where I don't want to watch sports. My place of comfort has been removed from me, and it may not be restored until there are actual sports leagues that remove politics from the sports.
So I couldn't help but think about that video after hearing what you shared with the audience in that talk with The Nation, because there were boycotts toward South African rugby teams in order to make a point about how apartheid needed to end. I thought that was a really powerful point. Can you talk about that a little bit, and how both pop culture, sports, forms of entertainment have been used as a way to push forward with a political movement and message?
I mean, he sounds like a classic sort of like white South African saying that, sports, they used to actually say that sports and politics doesn't mix. That was sort of their, so that they could, keep playing rugby, keep playing cricket tests, while literally there's the whole, it's like an occupying state, right? Like what an occupying army, but yeah, they playing cricket and tennis and rugby and so on. So it's very familiar. Before I just want to talk about the South African experience, the one thing that I found fascinating, and I do unfortunately consume a lot of like the sports media. I actually want to say that the U.S. discussions around sports, like sports programming, outside of the stuff that's happening in the field of play, it's way more fun to watch. Like watching. So an example would be, one of my favorite sort of guilty pleasures is a show here on Fox Sports. This guy called Shannon Sharpe and Skip. I mean, it's not, I don't expect rocket science from it. But what I found fascinating in the last couple of weeks is like there was one moment when Shannon Sharpe, who I think played NFL football. I think he's a Hall of Famer. And at one moment he's like, well, Skip, as the great Oscar Romero said in El Salvador, and I was like, what? This is what I think is interesting about sport, like how sport here, sport is keeping. So there's the stuff in the street, and everybody else is talking about elections and electionism and so on. Except for the independent media, of course, but in the mainstream. But what I find interesting about the mainstream here is like how then sports media kind of keeps the conversation going, because there's stuff about statues or what a coach said. And so the same guy, Shannon Sharpe, said something the other day where he said about the NASCAR ban on the flags, right, at NASCAR events. And he said something like, well, I mean, in Germany, you need special permission to use a Nazi flag. The flag is banned. Why are they doing it here? Why would they use a flag of something, try to defend a horrible regime? and act like it was normal. So like you see that kind of debate in sports radio that I don't think you often, that sort of emphatic description of like what is wrong and in a very common sense way that you don't, I think, often see in the mainstream. But just quickly on I think the lessons and the piece you referred to is about the attempt to, like, you know, isolate Israel, right? So the key thing about the South African situation was sports mattered for white South African identity, because white South African identity tied its success to, so the reason for existing of that regime, and that regime need like a kind of soft power, and the soft power was it was very good at rugby and it was very good at cricket. I mean, it was also in some places it was also very good in certain individual sports. So like golf, the golfer Gary Player, right, who was like one of the greatest golfers of all time. And then there's, you know, in tennis, they had some decent tennis players. I think one of them is like still a commentator on TV, this guy called Cliff Drysdale. So, you know, they had decent tennis players in certain individual sports and some athletes. So it mattered to them that they do successfully in sport. And secondly, that they were deemed to be a member of the community of nations. And so it meant the fact of participation counted for the legitimacy of South Africa. And so what happened at the end of the 1960s, it actually started in the early 60s with Dennis Brutus, who had gone to prison with Nelson Mandela. He had been arrested, then he was in jail, and then I think he was released and he was going to be rearrested, and he fled the country. And he started this thing called the South African Non-Racial Olympic Committee. And then they worked very hard, actually culminating in 1968. I think he met with the African-American athletes who did the Black Power salute at the games in Mexico. And they finally, eventually, they managed to convince FIFA to ban South African soccer, you know, the tennis, etc. They went on to the US Open in Nashville. But just back to the point about rugby and cricket. So what happened is and Wimbledon also, from the end of the 1960s, the beginning of the 1970s, many of these people said, okay, you can do what Dennis is doing by going to the sports associations and appealing that South Africa should be banned, but you can also disrupt the games. Now, if you couldn't do it in South Africa, you have to disrupt South Africans when they play outside, because, you know, that's where they thought they were legitimate, that people accept them. So they would disrupt Wimbledon, they would disrupt cricket matches when South African teams would play in Australia and Britain. And so eventually it got to a point by the late, I would say the early 1980s, the only way that South Africa could get teams to come to South Africa, well, first, they were not going overseas anymore. And the only way they could do it was for teams to come to South Africa. And so they would pay players. They ended up playing, sadly, also players from the West Indies, but Australia, England, to come and play games against them. These teams were usually called rebels. But the point is, by at least the early to the mid-1980s, it was very clear that they had lost this battle because of sports sanctions, and that it did a lot for their morale of wanting to be part of the world. And again, it's sort of very selfish. Like apartheid should end so that we could play tennis again, so that we could play rugby again. And I think in that way, it undermined the morale of white South Africa for something that seemed very trivial, but very powerful. And I think it's the same year in this country where you could see this around Kaepernick, right? Where when Kaepernick first kneeled, I think it was in 2016, he was a pariah of some sort, mostly in sort of mainstream white media. Right now, they're falling over their feet to like praise him. And some of them invent histories for themselves, including some black commentators like this guy, Stephen A. Smith. They suddenly all like, oh, I love Kaepernick, etc. So that's why I think sports is interesting to watch. Let me make one other quick point, which I don't want a misrepresentation to happen. It's true that Americans don't often look to the rest of the world, and it's very insular. And as I said, there are exceptions. There's always been an internationalist movement here. But it would be remiss from me not to mention the 1980s and the movement to divest from South Africa on campuses, the attempt to push through Congress by particularly black Congress people, the original sort of like where some elements of the black Congressional Black Caucus comes from, Ron Dellums, like people like that who were very crucial in that movement. So as I said, our campus movements to make that stuff happen, the churches, just like pushing the American debate on reform, which was called at that time under Reagan constructive engagement, and pushing for much more radical reform. And my last point on that is that was also a period that coincided particularly in Black and radical sort of left politics in the US, which is very much like third world politics, solidarity politics. So that stuff might come back, when people draw on the lessons of stuff that they did before, that they didn't do well. I think some of that might come back. So I don't want to create the impression that because of the exceptionalism of the United States and of the way that exceptionalism becomes kind of broadly dispersed in how people in the US think about who they are and what's possible, it's not entirely true. There have been moments here where Americans have made those connections with the rest of the world, and in trying to imagine a different kind of world.
Absolutely. Well, one of the ways that people can concretely engage in those subjects and reading and thinking about them is by reading Africa as a Country, which I read regularly, and also by subscribing to the YouTube channel, Africa as a Country. I will say I'm going to plug this Tuesday, I'm having William Shaki on the Michael Brooks Show, and we're going to get into really in-depth conversation on South African policing and teasing out some of those global dimensions. And I'm sorry, one more plug, because he was on a couple of weeks ago, and of course he's one of my regular co-conspirators. Check out Wozni Lambre's Hoops Adjacent podcast with David Aldrich, and that's actually a great example of what Sean is talking about. I really think it's true that some of the sports coverage in the United States and sports culture conversations are just light years ahead of certainly corporate mainstream media. And I always enjoyed watching Cliff Drysdale as a commentator growing up watching tennis, I have to admit. But at any rate, Sean Jacobs, really appreciate your time, man. Everybody check out Africa as a Country website, subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's really great.
Thank you very much for having me.
Take care.
Okay, thank you.
All right, are we going to take a brief break, or are we going to just keep going?
Let's keep going.
All right, it's time for, what do we got for Salt, Anna?
Oh, I love this story. So look, you got to take the light, fun moments where you can get them. And let me just preface this story by saying this is what democracy looks like. So I appreciate what this woman did, even though I disagree with her wholeheartedly. So there's a woman named Deborah Baber. She lives in Simi Valley, California. I only say that because she's very vocal about it. And she is absolutely and utterly disgusted by the mandatory nature of mask wearing in California right now. Recently, the Ventura County Board of Supervisors had a meeting to vote on whether or not they should implement mandatory mask wearing in public in response to this ongoing pandemic. As some of you might already know, there are almost 24 states that have seen a spike in the number of new coronavirus cases. And one of the best ways to, at least slow the spread is to wear masks when you're out in public. Well, it's turned into a nonsensical political issue. It shouldn't be polarized, but with someone like Donald Trump in office, who literally just told the Wall Street Journal that he thinks people are wearing masks in public to embarrass him and to make him look bad, it's become a political issue, right? Like, it's just ridiculous.
Asshole. Guys,
he literally said that in the Wall Street Journal.
I'm sorry. You got to get rid of Donald Trump. I'm sorry. There isn't. Let me just take 30 seconds on this. I disagree. Everybody knows my position in 2016. But the context, both in terms of the forward trajectory of the possibility in the Democratic Party with Bernie Sanders, and like Zizek said, like there was a different constellation around, and I still totally disagreed with it, but there was a different context around just the idea of having somebody that was like a smack in the face to establishment politics, period, even as it was like a regression and totally disgusting, which is, again, why I opposed, I did not want him to be president. I wanted to vote did vote strategically in 2016, but like, there just isn't, there's no strategic argument left. There's nothing. Like, you just get rid of the guy, and all the fun parts he can keep tweeting.
Totally. Yeah. And believe me, he will keep tweeting.
He will keep tweeting. We will have DACA. and potentially a slower rate increase of the national security state for the possibility of future organizing, and he will tweet all fucking day, which he's great at. Anyways, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and now I have to add one more thing to that, because recently there was a small business meeting in Nebraska with some Republican governors. And as this small business owner was talking about the challenges of opening back up in the middle of this pandemic, Donald Trump, like, he grabs his phone. She's speaking. He grabs his phone, looks around like, you know, like a mischievous high school student, and just like starts tweeting. And he starts tweeting about decoupling from China while this woman is talking about something that, by the way, he's advocating for. He's
so awesome.
It's just,
do you remember the solution? Do you remember the solution that we came up with? I think the solution was, maybe it was Lex's idea, but the perfect scenario, like if we were in a good world, Bernie Sanders is president and Trump is press secretary in a Sanders administration. That is like the best of all worlds. It's just like there were many losers trying to stop Medicare for all, which is really a beautiful thing. And it's for people.
No, he is an effective, he's a moron. He speaks like a fourth grader. Like, I acknowledge all of that. With that said, though, he is an effective communicator.
I mean, no, like, I'm into, like, he's really, like, absolutely a psychopath scumbag, and that's really worth noting and highly unusual, honestly. Like, even in the world of politics, which is filled with tons of cretins, like, there is absolutely, like, you know, his lack of even pretending to care about the effects of Corona, like, yeah, that's distinct. I'll keep saying it. Like, read that Edward Luce piece in the Financial Times. I don't know that he's actually, I don't really totally buy, like, I wouldn't say he's like smart, but I don't think I think he's very intuitive. I think he's very savvy. I think he's very, like, I think that ability, like that Bolton said that he called, and I believe he stole this from me. I think I said this first, but the fact that he called, you know, like Beto, like Juan Guaido, the Beto of Venezuela, like, he knows how to read things. And of course he just translates it into being like trash, because like that's who he is. He's just like a big messy bitch, but he's insightful. He's savvy.
That's fair. And he understands marketing. Like, he's got the intuitive nature when it comes to marketing and communication. So I'll give him that. So now that we've adjudicated like why this mask situation has become so politicized, Deborah Baber, who's a huge Trump supporter, goes to this, Board of Supervisors meeting to protest the mandatory mask wearing. And it produces one of the best videos I've ever seen in my career. It's not even hyperbole. I broke it up into lots of different parts so we can really stop and discuss. Let's go to the first one.
I protest face coverings. I am a healthy American. I used to be free. I am not a terrorist. I am not Antifa. I am not a sex slave that wears masks. I am not into sadomasochism and bondage. I am not a burglar. I am not a pandering politician like we see here and here and here and here.
No, I'm obsessed with her. I don't agree with anything she said, but she's amazing.
I love that energy.
I'm not a sadomasochist, which of course makes me think she's totally into sadomasochism, which, by the way, there's nothing wrong with that. Whatever gets your rocks off. But it's just like, what? Like, why did that have to come up out of nowhere?
She's not wearing a mask. Listen to her. Jesus Christ. I love this woman.
This is democracy, though, right? So I fully support this.
Like, the left and liberals are filled with like, well, actually, why did you say that? And oh my God, that's not okay. That's what. Boom. I am not Antifa. Not a sadomasochist. Yeah.
My favorite thing is like props and like pointing to pictures of like, people don't know what terrorists look like. So I'm going to go ahead and show them. Like, what? It's just insane.
Terrible content, amazing delivery.
Absolutely. Let's see a little more of that amazing delivery.
I am a proud Trump Republican, yearning to be free again. Who are you, victim or victor? If you are offended by anything I have said, by the masses of people, then I am offended by the masses of people who do not question your wholesale slaughter of our constitutional and inalienable rights. Shame on all of you. Let liberty ring.
Yes.
The props are amazing. And by the way, we know you're a Trump supporter. Like, we could tell from the hat and the, like, I love how the hat and the shirt was not enough. I also need to have, like, you know, a poster showing my absolute admiration for Donald Trump to really get that point across.
Oh my God. By the way, now I know, because I've been so thrown off at some of the stuff that Kale has been saying to us in show prep, and now I know where he cribbed it from. Kale goes, if you are offended, I am the one that am offended. I'm totally kidding. I love it.
By the way, wholesale slaughter. When she said wholesale slaughter, I'm like, oh, are we going to talk about like Yemeni children, like wholesale? No, of our constitutional rights, which, by the way, we should be concerned about what's happening to our constitutional rights. But she's maybe focusing on the wrong thing, right? Like she's mixing up
No, I mean, you're right. I'm thinking of like all of those classic like libertarian calls in the Majority Report where, like, you know, you'd start with like, yeah, there's that, like, our civil liberties are trampled systemically and fundamentally. And of course they don't consider this, but if you should, like the private surveillance economy, which is even worse and more dangerous, and the hybrid, all of this stuff. And then, so it's like, okay, yeah, totally. So what did you have in mind? I can't buy energy inefficient light bulbs anymore. Done.
It's just
states can't enslave people anymore. Rest my case.
It's so true. Oh my God. So, okay, let's go to this next one.
God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the oceans to the prairies to the mountains, white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home. Let liberty ring.
Thank you for your comments.
And it's Baber, Deborah Baber.
Thank you very much.
You should know better.
The next item is a Zoom.
You should know better. Okay. Like the calmness of that board member is incredible. All right. Next we have a Zoom. I think we're done listening about the foamy mountains we have in America. Let's move forward.
Can we have her on the show?
Kale, let's make it happen.
Swear to God.
Make it happen. No, I actually wouldn't mind interviewing her, right? Like, as long as, you know, she understands, like, this isn't going to devolve into a weird shouting match. Again, like, I don't think I need to say this, but I'll repeat that I probably disagree with her on everything. But here's a lesson that we can learn, something serious that we can take away from what we saw. Look, we need to stop taking ourselves too seriously, right? And have a little bit of a sense of humor about some of what's going on, because there is a point, I think, when some people on the right, you know, argue that we want to silence people, not hear their perspectives, not debate perspectives. Now, of course, they're guilty of the same thing. They would censor people on the left any day. But I'm not offended by that show that she gave. I'm actually inspired by it, and I want to see more of it from everyone, from anyone who has varying political ideologies, opinions, thoughts. That's what democracy is supposed to be, right? So I'm not intimidated by or afraid of that type of perspective. In fact, I want to debate it, and I feel confident in my beliefs and my values and my ideology. And I just think that we can all, maybe take something from that to open up dialogue and discussions that I think that the left, just as much as the right, has been guilty of trying to end or silence, whatever, censor.
Yeah, I
trying to censor stuff. Yeah, go ahead.
I agree. I mean, I also look, obviously it's ridiculous and she's talking a whole bunch of nonsense and bullshit, but there is like this element of like, just really save, and this just applies completely across the board, just like save your contempt for like actual people who like have actual power, like a political office, like not like, not Twitter, whatever, or media, whatever, let alone, and least of all, like a regular citizen, who, yes, the lady's a crackpot, but go out there, go for it. The subtext of like discouraging that participation, I think we should totally shy away from. I completely agree with you.
Yep.
And I would like a bell for this show.
So good. It's so good. I envision her practicing that whole spiel in front of a mirror, like she's like, okay, but you know what? I'm not really going to bring it home unless I sing. And by the way, she's got some good chords on her. She can sing. And I got to pull out that bell. Let liberty ring. So
I wish I advocated for freeing Lula like that.
I'd be into it.
And yes, I do support freeing Lula. So you can see what my Lula t-shirt, and in fact, every fucking episode of my show. That was awesome. Kale, do we have a super chat question or two before we wrap up?
Yeah, we do. So we got one from Kowalski from Nebraska.
Kowalski from Nebraska. What's up, brother?
Yeah, so he writes that got government grant and business loan for my farm, and the USDA didn't know that the Treasury did this. I guess that's some contextual information. The question is, how do people rationalize the desire for small government, yet they want federal programs like ethanol mandate and federal crop insurance? So I guess it's the kind of the old joke of, people saying, get the government's hands off my Medicare. So yeah, I guess the question about ideology, how do people rationalize maybe a conservative or a small government political project or program, or voting for those candidates, while simultaneously being the benefactors of federal government programs?
So that question actually reminded me of something that's related, but it wouldn't answer the specific question. So do you want to answer that? And then I'll tell you what I'm thinking about, Michael.
I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, I don't have that much depth in terms of like any like new ground here, which is that it's a government waste or welfare or whatever when it's for, them, not me. We know that the Republican Party is, the master practitioners of white identity politics and white identitarian politics. And I mean, I think that that's actually, that's one of the sort of splits in the Republican Party. And the sort of dominant wave has actually been some attempts to really scrap or really cut everything to some extent, just to distribute more and more and more and more resources to America's oligarchs. But there's always been that idea that if you, are in the right, have the right class position, have the right skin color in the Republican context, that you're entitled to stuff. And, you always see this, like in even things like, NPR, public broadcasting, never getting cut as much, because then all of a sudden, like rural Republicans who are, constantly race baiting and constantly trying to undermine the social safety net. Well, wait a second, all of a sudden their constituents need access to things like that. Maybe it will potentially. I mean, the postal service is under threat right now. That's a major issue, which we should talk more about, and that definitely also affects rural people. So I think it's just a kind of like inbuilt, basically racialized hypocrisy of how these programs are talked about and dealt with. And there are very, very, very few people who actually have a libertarian view of things, and mostly they're trust fund babies.
Yeah, and look, that question really reminded me of a disconnect that I've been seeing a lot lately, mostly because my partner's Cuban, and I pay some attention to what conservative Cubans think about this, the movement in America right now in response to police violence. So I believe it was last week, there was a small protest, mostly by conservative Cubans in Miami Lakes, Florida. That's a suburb near Miami. And they're very pro-Trump, and they're very pro-police and against Black Lives Matter. And I bring it up because conservative Cubans tend to be refugees, or they see themselves as refugees in response to the revolution in Cuba. And one thing that they bring up over and over again is, oh my God, the Castros were so awful. There was no freedom of speech. There's no freedom of press. You can't speak out against them. You'll be persecuted, right? And I just think it's so fascinating how they're totally in favor of the type of policing that's taking place right now, of state-sponsored murder, essentially, where people are running away from the cops and they're getting shot and killed in the back as they're running away. And by the way, these Cuban protesters that I'm speaking of are very much in favor of the insane violence by the cops against the protesters who are exercising their freedom of speech, exercising their First Amendment rights and protections. Anyway, these types of disconnects exist all over the place, and they're frustrating, and I think they're really hard to make sense of because they don't make sense. And that's why we need to celebrate these types of exchanges and debates that I think are being censored, are being shied away from. Maybe I'm going to get in trouble mentioning this. I don't really care. But Adolph Reed, for instance, should have been able to give his talk to the DSA, and there should have been a discussion about it. There should have been a debate about it. People should have been comfortable and secure in their beliefs. And you should have your beliefs challenged. You absolutely should. Because that's how you grow. That's how you learn. Everyone is going through or should be going through a political journey. And I think the less we celebrate that type of political journey, the more we're going to have instances like this where we see people advocating for things that they're supposed to be against, that they're vehemently against.
Adolph Reed should be welcomed, to speak everywhere. I mean, the idea of not, first of all, I will just say, like, the endless lies and demonization and distortions of Adolph Reed are actually just kind of like mind-blowingly disgusting and dishonest in and of themselves, and relentless, just on like a basic level of like pure dishonesty. But also, the idea of like turning away from as really singularly important, not only intellectual, but actually also labor organizers, unfathomable and ridiculous. It also, though, reminds me of The Sopranos. There's this great scene where they're talking about how they came to the country, how their families came to the country. Now, again, literally members of a mafia family, like in the Bush era, right? Still out, and one of them says, like, yeah, actually my old man, like, he actually came through Canada. He never even got his papers, and his old man was like a hitman for their crew, their family in New Jersey, and they're just kind of like ruminating on it, like, isn't that something else? Like, that's hilarious. And then out of nowhere, one of them's like, tell you what, they got to build that wall today, though. Like, got to seal that border up. And it was just, that's the reason that's probably the best show ever. It's just like the perfect distillation of the Republican and, definitely often like Democratic, just sort of like white middle-class mindset about this stuff.
Yeah. I was worried for a second because it looked like we only had a couple joke questions coming in, and we'll still get to those. But we just got a really good question.
We don't promise we get to all questions. We only do like 1, 2, maybe 3. So.
Well, Michael said it, not me.
That's always what I stipulate. We don't promise we get to all super chat. Yeah.
Well, this one is definitely worth addressing. This is question asks, how can we move the current Black Lives Matter movement to become multiracial, class-based? Seems identitarians and HR politics have lots of power in the current movement. So I think, Sean earlier in the interview, which I thought was a fantastic interview, he took a different view on this. That I think he laid out that he thinks that the new iteration of Black Lives Matter is something different than what we saw 4, 5, 6 years ago, which I think is undeniable. But I'm more of a pessimist on this in that I think it's revisionist to say that it's being co-opted. I think the fact that it is so permeable to begin with is part of the problem. But I would like to hear your thoughts. I mean, I know we've been talking about this for weeks on weeks, but any further thoughts on kind of maybe if there's any strategic interventions or any tactical interventions of how do we move the protests into a more class-based focus?
Well, I just have 3 quick thoughts. So like one is that, yes, like ultimately I'll say again and again and again, like, right. Like I think ultimately a mass-based union movement is like the thing that can have a countervailing force structurally to power. I believe that. I see that strategically. I also think though that it's like anybody can do critique and analysis and needs to. Like it's actually another really important distinction to make. You can't just because something's happening doesn't mean you can't like critically assess it. And Cedric Johnson, who I've interviewed and has written on this, is someone who's thinking about this very critically and creatively. And then, of course, on the other hand, like I think it's very important to be watching and reading what Angela Davis is saying about this right now. But you can't, like, it is what it is. You can't go in and reverse engineer. Like, this is what it is. This is what's happening, right? Like it isn't you. There becomes like this dangerous part where I think, like, again, I think the analysis is mostly correct, but then it's like, okay, so we're going to wait till some like point in the future when conditions fall into place, and that's just not how the real world works. That's actually anti-materialist in a way. So I actually, so again, there are movements and people that have at enormous personal risk. I mean, and also go back to Ferguson. There were people in Ferguson who died, frankly, under enormously questionable circumstances, let's say. We know the Department of Homeland Security is monitoring Black Lives Matter. This is very serious. And so we need to start from that basic standpoint of recognition of where the action is. Now, I actually think I'm more optimistic like Sean is, because I think the broader scope is the new iteration. And I think we had already seen very clearly that one on a side that, by the way, is actually part of a broader politics, which is like, yes, there are core civil rights and equity questions, and this movement addresses that, and that's great. I mean, that may not be structural in the sense, and I think this is actually another difference that Sean points out, that like, yes, there were these uprisings in 2013, 14, 15 that led to these reforms that have been shown to be insufficient. So now there's a much bigger, more systemic set of demands, which necessarily do start to implicate class structure, capitalism, and these other kind of interlinked variables. And then, so I have that optimism. Now, 3, I think that this is falling in an environment where without Bernie, there is just this new resurgence of, and it was frankly already happening. And I would not, like, the protests and the demonstrations are an enormously positive point, just even in terms of like real physical meeting of, like, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were murdered, right? But this kind of other part of like new waves of social media toxicity, looking for new reasons to attack people, new kind of like new regimens of like control and moralism and utter toxicity in the HR politics, like we have, the white fragility ladies on Jimmy Fallon. I mean, look, I think all of that stuff is incredibly toxic, hugely bullshit. And I think I'll shut up in a second, but one, we need to increasingly just full stop, not indulge any of that stuff in any way, shape, or form. I'm not the politics of gossiping, censoring, controlling, monitoring just needs to be completely rejected across the board, full stop, none of it. And then in addition to that, and I think this is where I align a lot with Jacobs, like, the answer to, like, there is a very substantive and global answer to, like, don't read like white fragility by this corporate consultant. Read Angela Davis, read Walter Rodney, read Adolph Reed, read Cornel West, read Cedric Johnson, read, really ground yourself in a serious, global, Black, and in addition, and truly global intellectual tradition. That's how you can understand the broader roots of these things. And I think, some of that is definitely happening. So one, you can't control what's in motion. Two, there are new iterations which are going in this direction, and you can read Jacobs' talks about the difference between the Soweto in '76 and then UDF in the '80s. It's a really interesting comparison. And then three, we have our marching orders for how to respond to this like renewal of the HR busybody, disgusting culture war stuff online, which is to just completely reject it, not indulge it in any way, shape, or form, and build a sophisticated, compassionate, strategic culture.
Yeah, I love that answer, and it's super comprehensive. So I only have one small thing to add to it, just to buttress your point, your last point. There was a super chat that we received on TYT asking, why it was that TYT as a company didn't release a statement about the Black Lives Matter movement and police brutality like all of these other CEOs for massive corporations did. And so it's funny because that didn't even cross my mind, mostly because I see those statements as incredibly hollow and nothing more than the performative politics that I completely disagree with and don't want to engage in. I think that releasing a statement means nothing. I think that actually being part of a movement, supporting it, educating people about it, going out there on the streets and being part of it, that speaks volumes compared to the superficial action of releasing a corporate statement about where your company stands on the movement. So that's just an example of what I think you're talking about, Michael, which is the weird policing that I see happening on social media right now in regard to, what are you tweeting about on this day? And is it sufficient enough to send a message about this important movement? Tweeting, look, Twitter and social media can be used as a tool to mobilize people, but tweeting is not political activism. And releasing statements also is not political activism. And we need to be aware of that.
Yeah, that's right. So let's just do, this is the lightning round, just to satisfy our lovely viewers in the chat. So the first one is from Billy Big Bricks, and he asks, thoughts on TX, the hot Terminator from T3?
I don't know that thing, so I don't have any thoughts, but sounds good.
Thanks, Billy. And then the next one, which Michael already actually covered a bit of this earlier in the show, from Champagne Comunista, they ask, any music recommendations for this weekend, particularly for Margarita Night? Also, thank you for everything y'all do, and individually and on the show together. So, any music recs?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead. You go first. I heard a song recently on my, Spotify playlist, but it's brand new, like to my world. So I got to look up the name. But you mentioned Chronics, right?
Naughty Dread cover. I'd listen to that. I'm listening to that like on repeat. And I'll recommend again, Kofi. She's awesome. And her live, her NPR Tiny Desk performance is great. And her cover of Burna Boy. You can look all these up. Certainly on YouTube, probably also on Spotify. Definitely. Those are my picks. Enjoy.
So look, I don't know if people are going to be into my music choices, but I made 2 of my playlists public on Spotify, which you can follow and get a sense of what I like. But Glass Animals is a new. Are you familiar, Michael, with Glass Animals by any chance?
Oh, what is it? Tell me.
It's more like in the realm of like dance music and stuff. I don't know. I had my raver days and they've never left me, even though I don't go to raves anymore, obviously. But I just really enjoy dance music and electronic music. So you'll get a lot of that if you follow my playlists on Spotify.
Kasparian swag. That's that Armenian.
It really is. It really is. But you know what? I'm not ashamed of it.
You shouldn't be. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Kel, we got anything else?
No, I think that's it this week.
That's it. Everybody stay safe, stay strong. We will see you next Saturday. Take care.
See you guys.
Bye, everyone.